The room gradually filled with people from all walks of life. Retirees interested in preserving their memories for grandchildren, middle-aged adults trying to capture parents' stories before it was too late, young people curious about their roots, and a few local history buffs. What had started 6 months ago as a one-time workshop had evolved into a monthly community gathering, the Pine Creek Oral History Project. Today's session was special. After months of collecting interviews and documents, participants would be sharing the family histories they had compiled. James had been amazed by the dedication many had shown, especially Patricia, who had dived into her research with unexpected passion. "I think we're ready to begin," James announced, taking his place in the circle. "Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we've spent the last few months learning how to gather and document family histories. Today we'll hear some of what you've discovered." He looked around the circle at the now familiar faces. Who would like to start? An older gentleman named Frank raised his hand. He had been researching his Japanese-American family's experience during World War II internment. "My mother never talked about this when she was alive," he explained, opening a binder of documents and photographs. "I had to piece it together from National Archives records and distant relatives' memories." As Frank shared his family's painful yet resilient story, James observed the room. People leaned forward, listening intently. Some took notes. A few dabbed at their eyes when Frank described his grandparents losing their home and business, only to rebuild their lives after the war. Several others shared their discoveries: a woman who had uncovered her grandmother's secret life as a civil rights activist, a young man who had traced his family's journey from Ukraine at the turn of the century, a retired teacher who had documented her father's experiences as a Tuskegee Airman. Throughout it all, Patricia sat beside her mother, occasionally whispering explanations or context. Mrs. Henderson had grown up in a different era, and some of the stories, particularly those about racial injustice, seemed to trouble her. Yet she listened, her expression thoughtful. "Patricia," James said during a brief break for refreshments, "would you be willing to share some of what you found? I know you've been working hard on your family research." Patricia hesitated, glancing at her mother. "I'm not sure if today is the right time." "It's your call," James assured her. "No pressure." Mrs. Henderson patted her daughter's hand. "Go on, Patty. I want to hear what you've learned." After the break, Patricia took a deep breath and moved to the center of the circle, carrying a scrapbook and a small wooden box. "I'm not as good at public speaking as some of you," she began, "but I want to share something important I discovered about my family." She opened the scrapbook to reveal black and white photographs of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothing. "These are my Irish ancestors who came to America during the potato famine in the 1840s. Like many Irish immigrants, they faced terrible discrimination. Signs saying no Irish need apply were common. Political cartoons depicted the Irish as violent, drunk, and not fully human." Patricia passed around some of the historical documents she had collected. "My grandmother never told me about this part of our history. She only talked about how the family eventually prospered, how they became real Americans." Patricia made air quotes around the phrase, her expression wry. "But here's what I discovered that really shook me." She opened the wooden box and carefully removed a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This is from 1921, when the Ku Klux Klan was active in our city. They weren't just targeting Black Americans, they were also against Catholics, Jews, and immigrants." She held up the clipping for all to see. "This article describes a rally where my great-grandfather, Joseph Henderson, spoke out against the Klan. He was Catholic, Irish, and still had an accent. He risked everything to stand up to them." Patricia's voice grew stronger as she continued. "He said something that stuck with me since I found this. He said, 'Today they come for me and mine, tomorrow they'll come for you and yours. Hatred doesn't stay neatly in its lane.'" She looked directly at James then, her eyes bright with emotion. "I never knew this story. Never knew I had someone in my family who stood up against hate. It made me realize that I have a choice about which family traditions I want to continue." The room was silent when Patricia finished speaking. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you for sharing that, Patricia," James said quietly. "That's exactly why this work matters, not just to document the past, but to help us understand ourselves better in the present." As the session continued, James reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 6 months ago, an ugly confrontation could have ended in further division. Instead, somehow it had become the catalyst for something healing and constructive. After the final presentation, as people mingled and chatted, a reporter from the local newspaper approached James. She had been covering the oral history project for a feature article. "Dr. Wilson, can I ask what inspired you to start this project?" she asked, recorder in hand. James considered the question carefully. Across the room, Patricia was showing her family scrapbook to a group of interested participants. Her face animated as she explained the significance of various documents. "It grew out of a difficult moment, actually," James replied. "Last fall, at a community presentation I gave, there was a confrontation that could have gone very badly." "I remember hearing about that," the reporter said. "Wasn't there a woman who made a racist comment?" James nodded. "There was, but instead of that being the end of the story, it became the beginning of one." He explained how he had invited Patricia to see historical documents, how she had done her own research, how a tentative conversation had grown into a community-wide effort to preserve family histories. "That woman is here today, isn't she?" the reporter asked, glancing around the room. "She is," James confirmed. "But I'd prefer not to identify her. People should be allowed to grow without being forever labeled by their worst moments." The reporter nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. So what would you say is the most important outcome of this project?" James watched as Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and limited mobility, stood to examine a display of historical photographs on the wall. Patricia hovered nearby, ready to assist if needed, but giving her mother space to explore on her own. "I think," James said slowly, "the most important outcome is that people are learning to listen to each other's stories with genuine curiosity and respect. When we understand where someone comes from, really understand it, it becomes harder to reduce them to stereotypes or to dismiss their humanity." "And has that happened here?" the reporter asked, looking around at the diverse group of people engaged in animated conversations. James smiled. "See for yourself. 6 months ago, some of these folks would never have spoken to each other. Now they're swapping family recipes and helping each other decipher old documents. It's not perfect, and we still have uncomfortable moments, but it's real progress." As the afternoon wound down, James found himself standing next to Patricia as they cleaned up the refreshment table. "My mother wants to be interviewed properly," Patricia told him. "She says she has stories about the civil rights era from a different perspective that might be valuable. I'm not sure what she means by that, but she seems eager to talk." "That would be wonderful," James replied. "Every perspective adds to our understanding." Patricia wrapped a leftover cookie in a napkin and handed it to him. "You know, when I first met you, or rather when I first yelled at you, I never imagined we'd end up here." "Life takes unexpected turns," James agreed. "Sometimes the most difficult moments lead to the most meaningful growth." "I was so angry that day," Patricia said quietly. "Not really at you, though I made you the target. I was angry at the world, at feeling left behind and forgotten. And now?" James asked. Patricia looked around the room at the community they had somehow improbably built together. "Now I'm too busy to be angry all the time," she said with a small smile. "And I've learned there are better ways to be heard than shouting." As they finished cleaning up and people began to leave, James reflected that this slow, imperfect, human process of growth and connection was perhaps the most powerful response to hatred he could imagine. Not a viral moment of clever comebacks that left crowds silent, but the quieter, more lasting work of building understanding across divides that once seemed unbridgeable. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Brennan guided Tamara through the intake area. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor, the sound echoing in the half-empty room. A few officers looked up from their desks, their eyes lingering a moment too long on her tailored suit and handcuffed wrists, before returning to their paperwork. "Sit here," Brennan ordered, pointing to a hard plastic chair bolted to the floor. Tamara complied silently, watching as he walked over to the booking desk where a heavy-set officer with thinning hair typed lazily at a computer. Her shoulders ached from having her arms pulled behind her back. The metal cuffs bit into her wrists, already leaving marks on her skin. She rolled her neck gently, trying to ease the tension building there. Across the room, Brennan and Schaefer were talking to the desk sergeant, occasionally glancing back at her. Their body language suggested casual conversation, rather than an urgent report about a dangerous criminal. Tamara strained to hear their words over the background noise of ringing phones and shuffling papers. Attitude problem from the start, she caught Brennan saying. Claiming she lives in Oakwood Estates? The desk sergeant raised his eyebrows and looked over at Tamara with obvious skepticism. She does have ID with that address, Schaefer admitted. Probably works for someone there. Housekeeper, maybe. A hot flush of anger rose in Tamara's chest, but she kept her face neutral. 15 years on the bench had taught her the value of an impassive expression. She'd seen too many defendants react emotionally and make their situations worse. That wouldn't be her tonight. After what seemed like an eternity, Brennan returned to where she sat. Stand up, he instructed. We're going to process you now. Tamara rose, wincing slightly as circulation returned to her legs. I'd like to make my phone call, she said evenly. Brennan smirked. All in good time. Booking first. He led her to a counter where her fingerprints were taken, pressing each finger onto a digital scanner with more force than necessary. Next came the mugshot, front view, side view, the camera flash momentarily blinding her. Name? Asked the processing officer, a young woman who hadn't looked directly at Tamara once. Tamara Mitchell, she answered clearly. Address? 47 Oakwood Circle, Oakwood Estates. The officer paused, finally looking up. Her eyes flicked to Brennan, who gave a small shake of his head. The officer returned to her form. Occupation? Tamara hesitated. She could say it now. Judge Tamara Mitchell of the County Superior Court. It would change everything instantly. The handcuffs would come off. Apologies would flow. Phones would ring as panicked calls went up the chain of command. But something stopped her. A deeper sense of justice, perhaps. If she revealed her position now, she would never truly know how others without her title were treated in this station. She would never have standing to speak about the experience firsthand. Legal professional, she said instead. Could you be more specific? The officer asked, sounding bored. I work in the county courthouse. This wasn't a lie, and it wasn't the full truth. Tamara watched as the officer typed courthouse employee into the form. After the paperwork came the search, a female officer patting her down with clinical detachment, checking every pocket of her suit, making her remove her shoes and jewelry. Her grandmother's pearl earrings and wedding band went into a small plastic bag, along with her watch and the fountain pen she always carried. Belt too, the officer instructed. Tamara complied, unbuckling the leather belt from her suit pants. I'd like to make my phone call now, she repeated. When processing is complete, came the same vague response. Next was a small room where her belongings were inventoried. Her purse was emptied onto a table. Wallet, keys, phone, lipstick, business cards kept face down, a pack of tissues, breath mints, and a small leather planner. The officer picked up her phone. Password? I don't have to give you that, Tamara said firmly. You can hold my phone, but you have no warrant to search it. The officer's jaw tightened, but he set the phone aside without argument. He knew she was right. Finally, the handcuffs were removed. Tamara resisted the urge to immediately rub her wrists, not wanting to show any weakness. Instead, she stood perfectly still as the booking process continued. What am I being charged with exactly? She asked. Disorderly conduct and resisting an officer, Brennan replied from where he leaned against the doorframe, watching the process. I did neither of those things, Tamara stated calmly. There was no disorderly conduct and I didn't resist at any point. The judge can sort that out, Schaefer said, joining his partner. If you make bail, that is. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Arrests on Friday nights often meant weekend stays in jail if bail wasn't arranged quickly. But they'd made a mistake. Today was Tuesday, and Tamara knew exactly which judge was on arraignment duty tomorrow morning. After processing, she was led to a holding cell rather than the larger women's cell block. Small mercies, she supposed. The cell contained a metal bench, a toilet with no privacy screen, and nothing else. The door clanged shut behind her, the sound reverberating through her bones. Phone call? She asked the retreating officer. Someone will come get you for that soon, he replied without turning around. Tamara sat on the cold bench and checked her watch out of habit, forgetting it had been taken. The wall clock outside her cell read 10:52 p.m. She'd been in custody for nearly an hour and still no phone call. Another violation of procedure to add to her mental list. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the wall. The concrete was cool against her scalp. She ran through breathing exercises she'd learned in a meditation class years ago. focusing on keeping her mind clear and calm. It was after midnight when an officer finally came for her phone call. By then, Tamara had mentally drafted and redrafted the complaint she would file, categorizing each procedural error and rights violation with the precision of someone who'd spent her career evaluating legal arguments. The officer led her to a wall-mounted phone. Standing close enough to hear every word, "You get 5 minutes," he said. Tapping his watch, Tamara considered her options carefully. Her husband was out of town at a medical conference. Her sister lived an hour away. Her court clerk would be home asleep. She could call a bail bondsman, but that felt like playing into their hands somehow. Instead, she dialed a number she knew by heart, the direct line to Judge Richard Winters, her colleague who was covering night arraignments this week. It was late, but Richard was a notorious night owl. He'd be up. "Winters," came the gruff answer after 2 rings. "Richard, it's Tamara Mitchell," she said, keeping her voice low but clear. "Tamara? Why are you calling at this hour?" "And from—" He paused, likely looking at his caller ID. "The police station." "I've been arrested," she said simply. "Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Neither charge is valid." A beat of silence followed. "I'm sorry, did you say arrested, you?" "Yes, I was pulled over near my home and things escalated quickly. I'm calling because they've delayed my phone call for over 2 hours, and I suspect they'll try to hold me until morning arraignment." Richard's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Are you telling me you're in lockup right now?" "Judge Tamara Mitchell?" "The very same. Though the officers don't know that part. I'm listed as a courthouse employee." Another pause. "Why didn't you tell them?" Tamara glanced at the officer standing nearby, pretending not to listen. "Let's just say I'm conducting a practical study of our system. I'll explain more tomorrow. Do you want me to call anyone?" "Get you out tonight?" "No," Tamara said after a moment's consideration. "I think it's best if this plays out naturally, but I'd appreciate it if you could make sure I'm on the morning docket." "And Richard, Officers Brennan and Schaefer are scheduled to testify in courtroom 3 tomorrow at 9 a.m. My courtroom." She could almost hear Richard's smile through the phone. "I understand completely. Get some rest, Tamara. Tomorrow will be educational for everyone involved." "Time's up," the officer announced, reaching for the phone. "Thank you." "Richard," Tamara said quickly before the line went dead. Back in the holding cell, Tamara finally allowed herself a small smile. The system had failed her tonight in multiple ways. But tomorrow the same system would give her an opportunity few ever received. The chance to face those who had wronged her on completely different terms. She stretched out on the hard bench as best she could, her suit jacket folded beneath her head as a makeshift pillow. The night would be uncomfortable, but the morning would bring its own form of justice. With that thought warming her, Tamara closed her eyes and waited for dawn. Morning arrived with the harsh clang of metal doors and the shuffle of changing shifts. Tamara woke stiff and sore from her night on the hard bench. She sat up slowly, running her fingers through her hair in a futile attempt to make herself presentable. Her tailored suit, usually crisp and commanding, was now wrinkled from serving as both blanket and pillow. A young officer appeared at her cell door around 7:30 a.m. "Mitchell, time to get ready for arraignment." Tamara stood, smoothing her clothes as best she could. "What time is court scheduled?" 9 o'clock, the officer replied, unlocking the door. "You'll be taken over with the morning group." She followed him to a small bathroom where she was allowed to wash her face and hands with a tiny bar of soap. The mirror revealed dark circles under her eyes and hair that refused to be tamed without her usual products. Still, Tamara straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. Appearance mattered in court. She knew that better than most. But today, the evidence of her night in custody would serve its own purpose. By 8:30, she was seated in a holding area with a dozen other defendants waiting for transport to the courthouse. Most wore the standard orange jumpsuits of longer-term inmates. In her rumpled but still professional attire, Tamara stood out like a rose among weeds. "First time?" asked the woman beside her, her voice surprisingly gentle for someone with a face hardened by difficult years. "Yes," Tamara answered simply. The woman nodded. "Keep your answers short. Don't argue. If the judge sets bail, just accept it and make your calls. Fighting only makes it worse." Tamara smiled faintly. "Thank you for the advice. No problem. We've all been new once." The woman studied her. "You don't look like you belong here." Neither do most people, Tamara replied quietly. At 10 minutes to 9, they were led through the underground tunnel connecting the jail to the courthouse. Tamara had walked this passage countless times, but always from the other direction. Always in comfortable shoes. Always with a security badge clipped to her lapel. The perspective from the other side was disorienting. As they emerged into the courthouse basement, a familiar face appeared. Court Clerk Danielle Washington. Her usual efficient demeanor replaced by wide-eyed shock when she spotted Tamara among the defendants. Judge Mitt, she began before catching herself. Ms. Mitchell? What on earth? Tamara gave a tiny headshake, silencing her. Good morning, Danielle. I believe I'm on Judge Winter's arraignment docket. Danielle stared for a moment, then composed herself with admirable speed. Yes, ma'am. Though there's been a change. You're actually scheduled for courtroom 3. Tamara couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Courtroom 3, her courtroom. I see, she said softly. And the officers from last night? Officers Brennan and Schaefer? Already upstairs for their regular testimony schedule, Danielle confirmed, a gleam of understanding in her eyes. Shall I escort you personally? That would be appreciated. Danielle turned to the corrections officer leading the group. I'll take this defendant up separately. Judge's orders. The officer shrugged, crossing Tamara's name off his list without question. The other defendants watched curiously as Danielle led her to a private elevator, one normally reserved for judges and court staff. Judge Winters called me at dawn, Danielle explained as the elevator doors closed. He said you'd been arrested but wanted to, quote, let things play out naturally. Do you want to tell me what's going on? I think it's better if you see for yourself, Tamara replied. But I will need my spare robe from the office. Danielle's eyebrows shot up, but she nodded. Of course. The elevator opened directly into the secure corridor behind the courtrooms. Danielle led her to her chambers, unlocking the door with her master key. Inside, everything was exactly as Tamara had left it the night before. Case files neatly stacked, her morning coffee mug clean and waiting by the small machine, her family photo smiling from the corner of her desk. The normalcy of it felt surreal after her night in custody. Your robe is hanging in the closet, Danielle said. I'll give you a few minutes. When the door closed, Tamara moved quickly. She splashed water on her face in her private bathroom, used the emergency toiletry kit she kept in her desk to brush her teeth and apply minimal makeup. Her spare suit in the closet would have been preferable to her rumpled clothes, but there wasn't time. This wasn't about looking perfect anyway. She slipped the black judicial robe from its hanger and put it on, feeling its familiar weight settle across her shoulders. In the mirror, despite the night's ordeal, she saw what everyone else would see. Judge Tamara Mitchell, respected jurist of the County Superior Court. A soft knock came at the door. They're ready, Danielle called. Tamara took a deep breath, picked up her case files, and stepped into the hall. Have officers Brennan and Schaefer arrived? She asked as they walked toward courtroom 3. Yes, Your Honor. They're seated in the front row waiting to testify on the Rodriguez DUI case. Perfect. They paused at the courtroom's back entrance. Through the small window in the door, Tamara could see the room was already full. Morning arraignments always drew a crowd. Lawyers, family members, students observing for class assignments. And today, sitting confidently in the front row, officers Brennan and Schaefer in their pressed uniforms looking nothing like the men who had handcuffed her the night before. Ready? Danielle asked. Tamara nodded. Danielle opened the door and stepped through. All rise, she called out in her official voice. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Tamara Mitchell presiding. The rustle of people standing filled the room as Tamara walked to the bench, her face a careful mask of judicial neutrality. She could pinpoint the exact moment the officers recognized her, Brennan's mouth falling open, Schaefer's face draining of color. Their stunned expressions would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. She took her seat, placed her files before her, and looked out at the assembled crowd. You may be seated, she said, her voice carrying the same authority it always had. As everyone sat, Tamara allowed her gaze to rest briefly on the two officers. Brennan was whispering frantically to Schaefer, their eyes never leaving her face. Good morning, everyone, she began, as she did every day. Before we begin the day's proceedings, I have a matter of procedure to address. She turned to Danielle. Clerk Washington, please note for the record that I will be. recusing myself from any cases involving Officers Brennan and Schaefer of the County Police Department due to a personal interaction that occurred last night. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The district attorney, a veteran prosecutor named Patrick Chen, looked up sharply from his notes. "Your Honor?" he questioned, clearly confused. "For those who are unaware," Tamara continued, her voice steady, "I was unlawfully detained and arrested last night while driving home from this very courthouse. The arresting officers," she paused, looking directly at Brennan and Schaefer, "are present in this courtroom today." The murmur grew louder. Officer Brennan had gone from pale to flushed, while Schaefer seemed to be trying to shrink into his seat. "In the interest of judicial propriety, I cannot preside over their cases. Judge Winters will handle all matters in which they are scheduled to testify." She shuffled her papers. "Officers, you are excused to report to courtroom 2 where Judge Winters is waiting." Neither officer moved, apparently frozen in shock. "Officers?" she prompted, one eyebrow raised. They stood awkwardly, gathering their materials with fumbling hands. The courtroom had gone deadly quiet, all eyes following the two men as they made their way toward the exit. As they reached the door, Tamara added, "And gentlemen, I believe this qualifies as that complaint I mentioned I would be filing." The heavy door swung shut behind them, with a definitive thud. Tamara allowed herself one deep breath before returning to business. "Now let's proceed with today's arraignments." But word travels quickly in courthouses. By noon, the story had spread to every corner of the building. Courthouse staff, attorneys, even other police officers stopped by courtroom 3 throughout the morning, ostensibly on business but really to confirm the rumors for themselves. During the lunch recess, Judge Winters appeared at her chamber door, a cup of her favorite tea in hand. "Quite a morning you've had," he said, placing the tea on her desk. "The police chief called me personally to apologize for the unfortunate incident." Tamara sipped the hot tea gratefully. "And the officers?" "Currently explaining themselves to internal affairs." Richard leaned against her desk. "You could have avoided all this, you know. One word about who you were, and then what?" Tamara set down her cup. "I'd have gotten special treatment while everyone else goes through what I experienced." "That's not justice, Richard. That's privilege," he nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" Tamara straightened the files on her desk, her mind already organizing her next steps. "Now," she said, "we make sure this isn't just about 2 officers and 1 judge. Now we create real change." By mid-afternoon, the courthouse buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Court officers whispered in corners, clerks huddled by the water cooler, and attorneys lingered in hallways, all discussing the morning's dramatic revelation. Even defendants waiting for their hearings had caught wind of the story. A judge arrested by officers who had no idea who she was. In her chambers, Tamara focused on completing her afternoon docket. Despite the parade of colleagues finding reasons to stop by, most offered sympathy or outrage. A few shared similar experiences. All wanted details. A firm knock interrupted her brief moment of solitude between hearings. Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal Police Chief Robert Wilson, his expression a careful mask of professional concern. "Judge Mitchell," he said, stepping inside and closing the door. "I came as soon as I heard. This is unprecedented." Tamara set down her pen and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Is it? The arrest or the fact that the person arrested happens to be a judge?" Wilson lowered himself into the chair, his uniform crisp and decorated with the various medals and pins of a 30-year career. "Both, I suppose. I've already placed Officers Brennan and Schaefer on administrative leave pending investigation." "That's standard procedure," Tamara noted, her voice neutral. "Would it have happened if I weren't a judge?" The chief shifted uncomfortably. "Judge Mitchell, I assure you our department takes all complaints seriously." "Do you?" Tamara opened her desk drawer and removed a small digital recorder. "I've spent the last hour dictating every detail of last night's incident, while it's still fresh in my memory. Would you like to hear how your officers conducted themselves?" Without waiting for a response, she pressed play. Her steady voice filled the room, methodically describing each moment from the initial stop through her night in the holding cell. The unnecessary hostility, the thinly veiled racial assumptions, the procedural violations, the delayed phone call, all recounted with the precision of someone accustomed to creating records that would stand up to scrutiny. When she stopped the recording, Chief Wilson's face had lost some of its professional detachment. "I must see," he said slowly. "This is troubling." "It's more than troubling," Tamara replied. "It's a pattern, one that happens to have caught the wrong person this time." Wilson straightened. "I want to assure you that this will be thoroughly investigated. The officer's body cameras have already been requested as evidence," Tamara finished for him, "as has the station footage from my booking. My clerk filed the request this morning." The chief looked startled at her efficiency. "Of course. We have nothing to hide." "I'm glad to hear it," Tamara said, leaning forward slightly, "because this isn't going away with a suspension and an apology. I've spent 15 years watching people walk into my courtroom who experienced exactly what I did last night. The only difference is they don't have my resources or position." She stood, smoothing her judicial robe. "This isn't just about me, Chief Wilson. This is about a system that allowed it to happen in the first place." Wilson rose as well, his height advantage diminished by Tamara's unwavering gaze. "What exactly are you planning, Judge?" "Justice," she answered simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a courtroom waiting." As the chief left, Tamara's phone buzzed with a text from her husband Thomas. "Just landed. Heard what happened. Are you okay?" She typed quickly, "I'm fine. Fill you in tonight. This might be the chance we've been waiting for." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of cases and rulings, Tamara maintaining her usual judicial composure despite the whispers and stares. By 5 o'clock, when she finally adjourned for the day, a small crowd of reporters had gathered outside the courthouse. Tamara considered slipping out the back entrance but decided against it. Hiding would send the wrong message. She stepped through the main doors, her robe exchanged for her still rumpled suit from the previous day. The reporters swarmed immediately. "Judge Mitchell, is it true you were arrested last night? Were the officers suspended? Do you plan to sue the department?" Tamara raised a hand and the questions died down. 15 years on the bench had taught her how to command a room, or in this case, a courthouse plaza. "I was unlawfully detained and arrested last night while driving home from work," she stated calmly. "The matter is under investigation, and I will not be commenting further at this time except to say this. What happened to me happens to people in our community every day. The only difference is that most don't have the platform I do to address it." With that, she moved through the crowd toward the parking garage where her court clerk had arranged for her car to be delivered from impound. The reporters followed for a few steps before courthouse security intervened, giving her a moment of peace. As she drove home, the emotional weight of the past 24 hours finally began to settle on her shoulders. The fear during the arrest, the humiliation of being handcuffed and booked, the discomfort of the holding cell, the sweet vindication of the morning's revelation, all of it crashed over her in waves, and by the time she pulled into her driveway, her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Thomas was waiting at the door, his face etched with concern. He wrapped her in a tight embrace the moment she stepped inside, his familiar warmth finally allowing her carefully maintained composure to crack. She buried her face against his shoulder, letting out a shuddering breath. "I've got you," he murmured, stroking her hair. "I've got you." Later, after a long shower and a change into comfortable clothes, Tamara sat with Thomas at their kitchen island, a cup of tea warming her hands as she recounted the full story. "I knew something like this could happen," she admitted. "I've heard too many stories from friends, from defendants, from community members, but experiencing it firsthand," she shook her head, "it was still shocking." Thomas reached for her hand. "What happens now?" "That's what I've been thinking about all day," Tamara said, setting down her mug. "This can't just be about me getting an apology and 2 officers being disciplined. This has to lead to real change." She rose and walked to the dining table where she'd spread out her notes and research. Studies on police bias, statistics on traffic stops by race in their county, news articles about similar incidents. "I've been collecting this data for years," she explained as Thomas joined her, always thinking there would be a right moment to use it. "I think that moment is now." Thomas studied the materials, his medical researcher's mind quickly grasping the patterns in the data. "This is compelling, but what's your plan?" "You're still a sitting judge. There are ethical considerations." "I know." Tamara sank into a chair. "I can't be an activist from the bench, but I can ensure this incident isn't buried or forgotten." Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Danielle, her court clerk. "Judge Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I thought you should know." The body camera footage from your arrest has been temporarily misplaced according to the police department. Tamara exchanged a glance with Thomas. Is that so? Thank you for letting me know, Danielle. After ending the call, she turned to her husband. And so it begins. The evidence is mysteriously missing. Are you surprised? Thomas asked quietly. No, Tamara admitted. Disappointed but not surprised. She tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the table. But they've forgotten something important. What's that? A small determined smile crossed her face. I wasn't just any arrest last night. I was booking number 7842B. There are records. There are witnesses. There is a paper trail. And most importantly, she held up her digital recorder. I have my own evidence. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're not going to let this go. I can't, Tamara said simply. Not when I might be the only person who can make it stick. She looked down at the scattered papers, years of documented injustices similar to what she'd experienced. Incidents that had been dismissed, buried, or simply ignored, each representing someone who hadn't had her power or position. Tomorrow, she decided, I'm calling Grace Turner at the Civil Rights Commission, and then I'm contacting the Department of Justice. This isn't just about two officers anymore. This is about the whole system. Thomas squeezed her hand. You know this could get messy. There might be backlash. Tamara met his gaze steadily. Some things are worth the fight. Outside their window, the evening news was already leading with her story. By morning, it would be everywhere. The judge who was arrested by officers who later appeared in her courtroom. It sounded almost like a movie plot, except Tamara knew the reality behind the headline. The fear, the anger, the injustice of it all. And she knew what came next would be even harder. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Hope that her experience might finally open the door to the changes she'd been fighting for from the bench. She gathered her research into a neat pile. Tomorrow would be a new battle. But tonight she had survived. And that in itself was its own kind of victory. 6 months passed like water rushing downstream, swift, powerful, and transformative. What began as one night of injustice had grown into something far larger than Tamara could have imagined that evening in her holding cell. The morning after her confrontation with Chief Wilson, Tamara had placed 2 important calls. The first to Grace Turner at the Civil Rights Commission, the second to an old law school friend now working at the Department of Justice. By noon, her personal experience had merged with years of similar complaints that had previously fallen on deaf ears. Today, standing at the podium in City Hall's main chamber, Tamara looked out at the crowded room. Reporters filled the back wall, cameras flashing. Community members packed the seats, many of whom had shared their own stories of mistreatment during the investigation. In the front row sat Thomas, her unshakable support through the tumultuous months. 6 months ago, she began, her voice clear and measured. I experienced firsthand what too many citizens of our community have endured for years. Today, I'm here not as a victim of that system, but as a witness to its transformation. Beside her stood Mayor Reynolds and the new police chief, Diane Powell, appointed after Wilson's resignation when the full investigation revealed a pattern of covered-up complaints under his leadership. The consent decree being signed today represents more than policy changes, Tamara continued. It represents acknowledgement, accountability, and a commitment to true justice for all members of our community. She stepped back as Mayor Reynolds moved to the microphone to detail the specific reforms. Mandatory body cameras with strict penalties for deactivation, a civilian oversight board with real enforcement power, comprehensive bias training conducted by community members, revised use of force policies, and a complete overhaul of the complaint process. As the mayor spoke, Tamara's mind drifted back through the challenging journey to this moment. The initial weeks had been the hardest. Once the story broke nationally, the backlash had been swift. Anonymous threats arrived at her office. Certain police officers created a deliberate slowdown in providing courtroom security. Conservative media painted her as an activist judge with an agenda. There were even calls for her recusal from all cases involving law enforcement. But for every attack, there came unexpected support. Other judges throughout the state shared similar experiences. Community members organized rallies outside the courthouse. Law enforcement whistleblowers stepped forward with their own accounts of departmental problems. The State Judicial Ethics Committee issued a unanimous statement supporting her right to seek accountability while maintaining her position on the bench. The turning point came when the station booking footage, which mysteriously reappeared after the Department of Justice announced its investigation, clearly showed the officers' unprofessional conduct. Even more damning was audio from the patrol car, where Officer Brennan could be heard saying, "These people always think they're special," as Tamara sat handcuffed in the back seat. There was no defense against their own recorded words and actions. Officer Brennan was terminated after the investigation revealed 6 previous complaints of similar misconduct. Officer Schaefer received a lengthy suspension and was reassigned to administrative duties with mandatory retraining. But Tamara had insisted from the beginning that this couldn't be about just 2 officers. The problems were systemic, requiring systemic solutions. Mayor Reynolds' voice brought her back to the present. "And now I'd like to invite Judge Mitchell to join me and Chief Powell in signing this historic agreement." Tamara stepped forward, accepting the pen offered to her. As she signed her name on the document, she thought about the impact this would have on countless future interactions between police and the community. No single solution could fix everything, but this was a significant step toward accountability and change. After the ceremony concluded, Tamara found herself surrounded by community members wanting to share their stories or simply express gratitude. An elderly woman grasped her hand tightly. "My grandson was arrested last year just like you, except nobody believed him when he said the officers planted evidence," she said, her eyes glistening. "Because of you, his case is being reviewed." A young law student pressed forward. "You're the reason I decided to focus on civil rights law, Your Honor." Seeing a judge use her position to create change instead of just accepting the system as it is. These interactions meant more to Tamara than any official recognition. For every person who spoke to her, she knew there were dozens more whose lives would be impacted by the reforms being implemented. Later that evening, Tamara and Thomas hosted a small gathering at their home for those who had been instrumental in the fight. Grace Turner from the Civil Rights Commission raised a glass. To Tamara, who turned a personal injustice into community justice, she toasted. Tamara shook her head. "This wasn't my victory. This belongs to everyone who spoke up, who shared their stories, who refused to let the momentum die." Her court clerk, Danielle, who had meticulously documented every piece of evidence, smiled. "It still took someone with your courage to start the avalanche." As conversations flowed around her living room, Tamara stepped out onto her back porch for a moment of quiet reflection. The night air was cool against her skin, the stars bright overhead. Thomas joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "I was just thinking about that night," she admitted. "When they first pulled me over. There was this moment when I could have told them I was a judge, and everything would have gone differently." "Do you regret not saying anything?" Tamara considered the question. "No," she finally said. "If I had identified myself, I would have gotten special treatment. The officers would have apologized, let me go, and nothing would have changed. They would have done the exact same thing to the next person who didn't have a title to protect them." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the hardest path leads to the most necessary changes. But the work isn't done," she added. "The consent decree is just paper until it's fully implemented. There will be resistance. There always is to change. And you'll be watching," Thomas reminded her. "We'll all be watching," Tamara corrected. "That's the real difference now. This isn't just my fight anymore." Through the window, she could see Grace deep in conversation with community organizers, planning the next steps for the Civilian Oversight Committee. Danielle was showing the new police chief something on her tablet. Likely the tracking system she'd developed for monitoring compliance with the new policies. What had begun with one traffic stop had grown into a community-wide movement for accountability. Not perfect, not complete, but progress. The following Monday, Tamara returned to her courtroom as she had every week throughout the process. The weight of her judicial robe felt different somehow, not heavier with responsibility but stronger with purpose. As she entered from her chambers, the familiar call rang out. "All rise. Court is now in session," the Honorable Judge Tamara Mitchell presiding. She took her seat at the bench, surveying the room before her. Defendants waiting nervously for their hearings. attorneys shuffling papers, court officers standing at attention, all part of a system that was slowly, painfully, but definitely changing. "You may be seated," she said, as she always did. Then she opened the first file of the day. This was where the real work continued, in daily decisions, in careful listening, in ensuring that justice wasn't just a word but a practice. The consent decree would help with accountability, but true change would come through thousands of individual interactions where dignity and rights were respected. A young public defender approached the bench, representing a defendant who looked barely out of his teens. As Tamara listened to the case, she noticed something different in the attorney's demeanor, a new confidence in challenging the officer's account of the arrest. Change happened in small ways before it happened in big ones, in questions that weren't asked before, in challenges that weren't raised, in voices that had been silent finding their courage to speak. Tamara had always believed in the system's potential, even while acknowledging its flaws. Now she had seen both its failures and its capacity for reform firsthand. As the day's docket progressed, she carried that knowledge with her in each ruling, each interaction, each moment where she had the power to ensure that justice was not just promised but delivered. One case at a time, one day at a time, one step at a time, it was enough.